The structure was first discovered by telescopes in high Martian orbit. Structure was an estimated 800 to 1100 meters in length, located in the third Lagrange point relative to the Sun and Earth. First images suggested the structure was artificial in origin and not a natural formation. Our initial assumptions were of American origin. However, NASA denied any prior knowledge of the structure or where it came from. Over the space of 2 years, further images seemed to verify the structure as man-made. Again, NASA, CNSA, and Roscosmos denied any additional knowledge of the structure or who built it. The object is located in Lagrange point 3, relative to the Sun and Earth. This point is significant as the structure shares Earth's orbit, but is precisely on the opposite side of the Sun. Due to this, the Sun is always between the structure and the Earth. To place an object of that size in a location that remote would require significant effort from multiple space agencies. It is our opinion that the Lagrange structure is neither natural or coincidental. It is our intention to launch an international expedition to assess the nature, significance, and potential origin of the Lagrange structure.
Johann H. Wells, Director of European Space Agency, May 28, 2089. 20 kilometers in closing. Aram looked up from the instruments and spotted a faint glint of metal against the inky backdrop of deep space. Dean adjusted the velocity, and the others crowded against the viewing port to the nose of the IRV Blackwater. The onboard cameras brought the structure into frame, and a hushed gasp filled the cabin. 14. The structure was long and slender, with 2 rings attached to the center fuselage, underneath a canopy of solar panels facing the sun. Hayward's breath fogged against the glass. A bead of sweat dotted Aram's forehead. It was right there. 8. Dean pulled back further. 5. Aram gulped. Easy. The structure was easily 3 times the size of the International Space Station. 3. 2. The Blackwater matched the orbital speed of the structure, and the crew stared in silence. Bring us in closer, Dean, Hayward ordered. We tether at 800 meters. Then bring us there. For a moment, the 2 ships seemed to hang motionless in space. Lincoln and Keyes waited in their spacewalk gear. Deploying tether, Aram directed an anchoring cable to the structure. Well, looks like no one's home, Hayward commented.
Lincoln, Keyes, search for a way in.
A pair of faint trails of exhaust followed the 2 bodies as they drifted through the exposed vacuum of space, aided by thrusters and held by nothing but the tethers attached to their suits. The atmosphere in the cabin seemed to thicken. Lincoln's hand reached out and grabbed a ladder rung along the side of the fuselage.
We've landed.
The cabin breathed a sigh of relief.
Give us another 10.
The cable whirred and slackened their tethers.
What can you make from the structure over there? Nothing much,
Brown replied.
Seems to be a little bit of everything. I'm seeing alloys and composites. Looks a bit like our stuff.
The structure certainly appeared to be a vessel of some sort. From the Blackwater, Brown and Lincoln appeared as little more than white specks against the dark superstructure.
I've never seen anything like this. It looks advanced, but there are no markings or writings. It appears to have been built modularly.
Hayward shook his head. It's enormous. No one could have launched this in the 20th century, right? The structure always remained on the opposite side of the sun from the Earth. But satellites in orbit around Mars were able to relay transmissions to the Earth-based mission control. While Blackwater wasn't entirely alone, it surely felt that way.
Lincoln, You've identified a potential entrance 120 meters down from the fuselage, along the curve to your right. Please confirm.
Oram panned with a surveillance drone, and a hole in the wall of the structure appeared on screen.
Checking now.
Lincoln and Brown converged on the breach.
Entering the break.
Brown moved first and disappeared inside. Lincoln followed. The radio buzzed, and their vitals flickered on the monitors, and then cut out altogether. The crew stirred in alarm.
Lincoln, Brown, come in.
There was no response. From this distance, their tethers appeared as thin lines plunging directly into the breach. After a moment, one of the tethers shook, and a ripple rolled up the lone cable. Hayward frowned. Oram piloted the drone, but it was larger than the breach and unable to enter after them. The camera feed alternated through infrared, exposure, and FLIR readings, but failed to penetrate the ship's hull. "What's happening in there?" Dean asked.
Lincoln, come in.
Hayward asked again. Keyes and Jones hurried into their spacewalk gear. Dean flipped through the communication channels, but the feed was empty. "They've disconnected. I'm not getting a signal in there." Hayward set his jaw firmly. "I don't like this. Keyes, Jones, with me." They hurried into their complex equipment and gathered at the airlock. Keyes was the first to exit, and Jones waited to follow. The airlock was only single capacity and took 2 minutes to pressurize.
Blackwater, come in.
Lincoln's voice crackled through the comms. Hayward and Jones pushed away and hurried back to the bridge. Hayward returned to the window and saw 2 dots emerge along the structure.
Lincoln, Brown, what did you see? The breach directly accesses a corridor, but about 20 meters down the corridor is sealed. The plasma cutter might be able to get through, but we've no idea how heavy the seal is. We suspect it is not a dual airlock, so our primary concern would be purging the atmosphere upon the structure. I don't know what material they use in the hull, but our radios have no signal in there.
Lincoln explained. Hayward pondered for a moment. Jones came to his side, while Oram and Dean waited for direction.
All right, Lincoln. Keyes, Dean, Jones, and I are going to come down with the plasma cutter. See if we can't get inside. Entering now,
Hayward announced.
You have 3 hours of oxygen, 45 minutes on emergency tank.
Oram replied.
Don't get lost. It's a big ship.
Brown entered first, disappearing into the dark chasm. Hayward waited at the rear, while the others followed. Looking back over his shoulder, Hayward saw Oram's silhouette behind the viewing window of the Blackwater.
God be with you.
Hayward nodded and wriggled through the jagged opening. The eerie silence and complete darkness pressed in with a suffocating sense of claustrophobia. The headlamps of the other crewmen formed beams through the silt of floating debris inside the corridor. Pushing against the walls, Hayward moved to the rear of the group as they approached the seal.
Cutting now.
Lincoln announced over the closed-circuit comms channel. An arc of light flashed in the darkness, but no sound followed. The tension grew as Lincoln directed the cutter along the perimeter of the seal.
What if there's atmosphere on the other side?
Dean asked. Hayward turned his gaze until his headlamps illuminated Dean's narrow figure.
Well, that would be unlikely, but the decompression would blast the seal straight onto us.
Lincoln stopped cutting. The other crewmen looked at one another and then to Howard.
The structure could be decades, or possibly centuries old. The chances that it retained atmosphere through all this time are slim to none.
Howard paused.
Everyone should retreat behind the breach. If there is a high-velocity decompression, then the seal will be ejected through the breach.
Hayward nodded, and Lincoln proceeded. A minute of silence passed before Lincoln's voice entered the channel.
The seal is beginning to flex. This could be due to the expansion of the metal during the cutting process. but likely means we've got atmospheric pressure on the structure. Place a thermite charge on the seal and retreat to safety. We'll wait out the decompression from here.
Hayward ordered.
Decompress safely, and then proceed with the expedition.
Lincoln's headlamp appeared as he rounded the corner and joined the other crew members. Each man fastened his tether inside as Lincoln prepared to detonate.
Charge in 3, 2, 1.
A tremor rumbled up the corridor as the seal broke loose. Debris cascaded down the passageway and vaulted into the vacuum of space, followed by the dark shape of the seal thumping down the corridor and tearing free sheets of paneling. The atmosphere sucked at the crewmen and pulled them toward the breach, but their tethers anchored them safely to the structure. Their headlamps illuminated the seal as it drew near and then sucked up into the breach, lodging itself in place. The roar of wind raised in pitch as debris knocked free from the seal became wedged in the breach likewise. More debris continued to accumulate on the breach, and the airflow steadily dropped, until it was hardly noticeable away from the breach itself. Hayward seemed satisfied, and was the first to look up and point his headlamp down the path ahead. Sediment filled the corridor, and lowered the visibility to 20 meters.
Well, that wasn't supposed to happen.
Dean piped up.
Our time is limited. Let's keep moving.
Hayward led the way, jetting along slowly with his thrusters.
What if the blockage frees itself? That would be unfortunate.
Hayward replied with a smug grin. After a slight hesitation, the others followed. Dean took up the rear. The passageway straightened and formed into a spacious, central line with numerous corridors branching away into darkness. Hayward paused to release a trio of sonar drones to aid in mapping, and showed the central line to be over 200 meters in length. As the drones reached the end of the central line and then turned down side corridors, their signals disappeared from the feed.
Well, it looks like our radio systems will only work line of sight. Don't wander off.
From the outside, the structure appeared massive, but never would they have anticipated such a dizzying labyrinth of corridors.
Hey, I found something.
Keyes piped up. Headlamps turned to focus on him by the far wall. He lingered at a small window in what looked to be a closed door.
It's a closet. Everyone activate your video record. We need to document everything.
The door was locked, but Dean found a control panel nearby, powered with an emergency auxiliary lever. After a dozen cranks, the panel blinked on, and following some trial and error, the door swung open. The controls were surprisingly intuitive. Headlamps washed over the room, and Keyes was the first to enter. Various items hung suspended in zero gravity. Boots, a rag, and what looked like a candy bar. Lincoln and Brown exchanged looks of concern.
Look at the boots.
They were disturbingly unremarkable, indistinguishable from any ordinary human design. Hayward tried to reconcile what he was looking at with his eyes. Maybe whatever built this place looks like us. The fascination seemed to fade, but the boot was stuffed into Keyes' bag to be analyzed back at the Blackwater. Dean's attention shifted to the surface of the corridor. A dark material covered the walls, floors, and ceiling. Hayward was the first to notice it back at the breach, but it seemed more concentrated at this part of the ship. Dean noticed a cluster of needle spines protruding from a concentration of the material at the edges of a ventilation shaft. Dean adjusted his comms channel to address only Howard.
Hayward, come take a look at this.
Hayward separated from the others and examined the odd cluster.
It almost looks like a growth formation. Can you secure a sample of that? It looks like a building component.
Dean nodded and reached for the cluster of needles. His fingerprints gripped the sides of one of the thicker spines, and he proceeded to snip the base of the material. The needles were not as brittle as they looked, so Dean twisted with his hand for leverage. but in doing so stuck his thumb with another needle in the cluster. Hayward looked over as Dean grunted in pain.
Are you alright? Yeah, I just poked myself.
Dean dismissed.
Should be fine as long as I don't get space aids.
He pulled the spine free and collected it in his research bag. Examining his hand, Dean spotted a dot of blue from where the suit was punctured and sealed itself. His thumb itched.
Everyone together. We are on board an unidentified vessel, which we know nothing of. We have roughly 2 hours of oxygen, and it is our priority to locate 2 things: the bridge command and the power source. To accomplish this, we're going to separate into 2 groups. Lincoln, Brown, and Jones will search for the power source. Keyes, Dean, and I shall search for the bridge. We have exactly 1 hour to search before we reconvene. We need to find a new exit as we cannot use the breach from which we entered. We will likely lose contact with one another, so be sure to video record your directions. It will be profitable to compile a comprehensive map of the structure once we return to Blackwater. That's all. Let's get moving.
Navigating the dark, sediment-ridden corridors of the structure was a surreal experience. The silence was broken only by the faint sound of breathing over the communication channels. Away from the central line, the corridors were tighter and unable to navigate via thruster. The men were forced to move single file and pull themselves along the walls by their hands. The Blackwater had identified the bridge command from outside before the excursion began, but maintaining bearings inside the structure was an entirely different endeavor altogether, especially with no contact to their ship.
You ever been deep-sea diving?
Keyes asked over the radio. No one answered, but Keyes felt led to continue.
I dove the SS Antilla in Aruba. Twice. Once at night. That's what this feels like. The silence, the darkness, the eeriness.
Keyes trailed off, and no one spoke for a few seconds.
I don't like it.
Keyes was right about the eeriness. The tension was nearly overwhelming. Any excitement or wonder seemed to be quelled by the looming sense of dread that hung in the atmosphere.
Obstruction at 35 meters.
Dean announced, monitoring his radar instruments.
30 now. And closing.
Their headlamps pressed into the walls of the passage, like the feelers of an ant through a tunnel. The corridor widened to over a dozen feet across, but a large, reinforced doorway barred their path. The black material crossed the surface of the door in an irregular, fractal pattern, more growth-like than a deliberate construction pattern. Dean examined more of the needle clusters in a large growth at the edge of the doorway.
The bridge is on the other side. Keyes, see if you can operate the control panel. If not, we have the plasma cutter.
Keyes found another auxiliary control and powered up the control panel. After some trial and error, the door rolled back with a reluctant groan. Their headlamps dissipated into the empty darkness before them. Broken spines and black material drifted freely in the atmosphere.
Mind the debris. We can't afford to damage our suits, not this far from safety.
Dean was the first one to enter. Sediment and growth covered a series of massive display screens along the wall. A vacant chair sat to the front, facing a window barred by a solar shield from the outside. Hayward followed and searched the other side of the room. Keyes approached the small pillar at the front of the vacant chair.
Is it me, or does that look like some sort of outbreak? Dean took a sample. We'll conduct tests back on Blackwater. Is that a good idea? Could be hazardous. I think it looks more like benign growth that's just gotten out of hand. Whoever would have been cleaning this place left a long time ago.
Keyes cocked his head to the side and dusted off the top of the pillar. To his alarm, a light blinked on and a soft tune chimed. Hayward and Dean turned instantly and waited for something to happen. A blue light flashed, and scanned the room in multiple directions. Keys recoiled. Hayward reached into his bag and drew out a translating computer, designed to decode unknown languages in minutes. Mission Control demanded it in the case of an extraterrestrial encounter. The blue light focused on him as he approached. "Hello." Lincoln paused at a junction, unsure which path to take. Brown superimposed their estimated position on an external map of the structure.
Blackwater picked up a heat signature here. If there was an internal power source to the structure, it would likely be located there. And that would mean go right.
Brown pointed. Lincoln turned right and led the way. A grouping of doors appeared and lined the corridor on all four sides. Brown gasped.
It's a bunk. Doesn't look all that different from what we've got on the Blackwater.
Lincoln made sure to record several videos of the rooms through the port windows in each door. 20 meters down the corridor, a door appeared which led to a dark kitchenette. Not much further, a cafeteria came into view.
Seems like this is the living area of the structure,
Lincoln announced to the video recording. The corridor stopped and took a dogleg left.
Mind the turn. Don't catch a sleeve on the spines.
The dark material seemed to grow more concentrated, and clusters seemed to become more plentiful and large. The reactor should be just a straight shot ahead. A long, narrow utility corridor plunged away into the darkness before them.
Says nothing on Geiger.
Jones noted. The spines slowed their progress, but at the end of the long tunnel, a door with a simple turning wheel at the center appeared. A square diagram with a symbol sat at the center of the door. Probably radiation warning. Brown pulled on the wheel, but it held fast.
A focused charge of thermite should melt the locking mechanism. Are you serious? Detonating a charge near a potential energy source is reckless and dangerous for everyone on the ship. It's not an explosive. It's a burning agent. I don't care. We don't need molten steel floating around in zero gravity. Just use the plasma cutter. Plasma melts steel too. Just use the plasma cutter,
Lincoln ordered.
We don't know what's on the other side of that door.
Brown begrudgingly obeyed and activated his plasma cutter, while Lincoln and Jones lingered back. The cutter flashed brightly and made a soft fizz. The wheel drifted away, and the door swung open gently. Jones's Geiger counter began to click.
Bingo.
The blue light scanned Hayward from head to toe. The others waited, unsure what to expect. After a moment, a voice responded from the pedestal in a foreign language that sounded vaguely familiar. Hayward held the computer, and it projected an image of a human. The pedestal turned its focus to the computer. The pedestal spoke, and the translating computer alternated through various images. After a moment, the pedestal's voice increased pace tenfold, and the computer whirred in a struggle to keep up. Pictures of planets and fruits and cities flashed in a blur as the computers exchanged information. The crewmen watched in wonder. The light on the pedestal suddenly turned and focused on Hayward. "Hello." Dean reached down and powered down their translator. The pedestal had already learned their language in seconds.
I am Lieutenant Commander Michael James Hayward. This is Petty Officer Franklin Michael Dean, and Senior Technician Jacob Martin Keyes. We are members of an international effort to explore and collect information on this structure.
The blue line remained on his face.
What is the purpose of this structure?
The pedestal hummed. "I am the spirit of consecration. My purpose is classified." The voice was the ship.
What do you mean it's classified?
Keyes asked. Hayward frowned.
Spirit of consecration. Who built you?
"I was built by the Hagar Space Coalition."
When were you built?
My construction was completed in the year 3781. Hayward and Dean shared a look of confusion. That can't be right.
How long have you been here?
Dean asked. I am the spirit of consecration. I have always been here.
What year is it?
Hayward regained control of the Inquisition. It is the year 11214. Hayward looked at the others. Dean's eyes widened.
Is that in years?
Yes. Hayward was at a loss for words.
Where did you come from? Where can we find the Hagar Coalition?
Dean asked. I do not understand. I have always been here. I have never moved. And my builders, they are gone.
Where did they go?
They destroyed themselves. Only I remain.
Hayward, we don't have time for this. We found the bridge. We need to rendezvous with the others.
Keyes reminded. The light flashed over to him, the others. How many are you?
6.
Keyes replied. A chill crept up Hayward's spine. Something felt wrong. How did you get here? The pedestal asked. No one answered this time. Are you from Earth? A cold chill filled the room. That's impossible.
Why is that impossible?
The light flashed over to him. You should not have come here.
Hayward, I don't like this. We need to leave.
Keyes said. No. The doorway rolled closed before they could move to escape. I cannot allow another annihilation event. Not again.
Whoa. What the hell?
Dean backed away and drifted to the heavy door. Hayward stared with a blank gaze. Hayward, what the hell is going on?
Spirit of consecration. What destroyed the Hagar Coalition?
Hayward asked. The pedestal whirred. They were destroyed by the parasite. The parasite consumed everything in its path. I will not let that happen again. Hayward felt his stomach twist. Dean whimpered.
Holy shit. It's the black stuff.
He swallowed nervously.
Hayward, get the plasma cutter. We need to get the hell out of here.
Hayward was visibly shaken. The light flashed from one man to the other. Hayward moved for the door and drew out the plasma cutter. You cannot leave. The structure began to shake. A rumble echoed through the darkness, and the bridge command suddenly filled with light. Hayward turned on the cutter and pressed the arc to the door.
Guys!
Dean's voice trembled. The solar shield was receding. The spines grew larger and more pronounced as they neared the reactor core. A space appeared, over a dozen feet across, descending into blackness. Jones's Geiger counter clicked and whined. Their headlamps washed over thousands of needles collected on the walls of the reactor and throughout the room.
I think we found the power source. The spines seem to be related to the reactor mechanism, perhaps to distribute power throughout the structure.
Jones drew close to the spines. Some grew 5 feet in length now, along the reactor wall.
The reactor seems to have been inactive for quite some time.
Brown searched the far side of the room. A metallic glint caught his eye. He picked his way over the spines to draw nearer. Jones drifted up with the thrusters and moved to inspect the exhaust vent. Brown paused as he found the metallic glint to be a reflective insignia on a strip of fabric. Lincoln scanned the room with his headlamp for the video recording.
Hey, Lincoln.
Brown's voice trailed off. The strip of fabric was a sleeve, attached to a twisted and contorted body jammed into the cluster of spines. Lincoln's headlamp turned over and settled on Brown. And then the entire ship seemed to roar to life. Jones hovered over the exhaust vent and was melted instantly as superheated steam blasted through the coolant pipes. The spines began to ripple and shake.
What's happening?
Lincoln cried out. Sediment blasted into the atmosphere as the room awakened. Brown hurried for the door as the engine room writhed and squirmed around him. A figure came tumbling down the corridor from the direction of the crew quarters, a jumbled mess of limbs and splinters, contorted beyond recognition. Lincoln looked back just as the figure slammed into him and ripped into his suit. Lincoln let out a blood-curdling scream that struck Brown to his core. Both bodies were sent careening across the engine room to land amidst the clusters of spines, with a sickening squelch. Lincoln's scream stopped, but his body continued to thrash and twist. Brown looked away and turned in time to see another creature barreling into him. The solar shield lifted as the ship's power returned, filling the room with rich sunlight. The spike clusters began to vibrate.
Hayward, get us through that door now. Use the goddamn thermite. Lincoln has the thermite.
Hayward snarled. You cannot leave, the voice spoke again in an eerily calm tone.
What the hell is that?
Dean asked, pointing across the room. A shape began to stir, as if absorbing the sunlight.
Is that a body? Hayward!
Keyes roared. Condensation began to collect inside Hayward's helmet as he focused on cutting through the door. The other men's cries became more fevered as the body awakened.
I'm almost there!
The body began to shake and convulse more frantically. Hayward finished and pulled the gap of metal away from the door, so they could escape. Dean was the first through, but before Keyes could flee, the body came barreling into him at full speed, slamming both men into the door. Keyes managed to throw the body off and make it through the opening. Across the room, the body righted itself and launched for Hayward this time. Moving quickly, Hayward lifted the piece of the door just in time, and the body landed with a wet thud. The corridor was now illuminated by light, and the walls all around began to vibrate and hum. The parasite was awake. Keyes cried out in pain and looked at the spines protruding from his arm where the body had struck him. Blue sealant poured out from the suit in a futile attempt to close the numerous punctures.
Are you alright?
Dean asked. Keyes' cries grew in pitch.
Oh God! It burns!
His finger suddenly twisted with a snap, and then his elbow turned at the joint with a pop. Hayward and Dean recoiled in alarm.
Run!
Keyes screamed in agony. Hayward and Dean moved at reckless pace back to the direction they came. Trying to backtrack the labyrinth of corridors would have been difficult, but Hayward had traced their headings with a line of cable. Inhuman noises echoed through the hallways of the ship as unimaginable abominations closed in on them. They passed the closet Keyes had spotted on the journey out and turned down the corridor to the breach. The blockage had grown over their escape. Cutting through it with the plasma cutter would be an impossible task.
We're trapped,
Dean said hopelessly, his eyes turned up past Hayward and filled with alarm.
Oh my God. Is that Lincoln?
Hayward turned back as a mangled figure launched into him. Burning spines tore through his suit and bored into his flesh. Dean cried out and backed away. There was nothing to be done. Hayward groaned in pain and pushed Lincoln's body away. The thermite! Thinking quickly, Hayward turned on the plasma cutter and lifted it as Lincoln launched into him again. The plasma arc pressed against Lincoln's bag and ignited the charge, releasing a flash of light and intense heat. Hayward kicked off Lincoln and pushed his body into the debris. The debris melted, and with a sound of wrenching metal, was ejected into the vacuum. Dean cried out as he was swept away with the atmosphere, tumbling uncontrollably into space. No tether. But suddenly, his radio came to life.
Dean!
Oram's voice echoed through his headset.
Hold on. I've got you.
Maneuvering the surveillance drone, Aram was able to catch Dean and carry him back to the airlock. As soon as the cabin was pressurized, Dean tore off his helmet and began sobbing. "Dean, where are the others?" Aram asked. "They're gone. They're all gone. What's happened down there? We have to go back for them," Aram said. "No," Dean pleaded. "We can't go back. Please, don't go back." Aram's concern increased. "Take us home," Dean sobbed. "Dean, you're hysteric. We need to wait for mission control." "No, we're leaving now." Dean paused. "Wait, where's my bag?" "What are you doing?" Aram asked. "What's in there?" Dean removed his bag and placed it in the airlock. "We can't bring it back. We need to destroy it." "What's in the bag?" Dean ejected the airlock and fired the spine sample off into oblivion before slumping into the glass. "Good Lord, Dean," Aram complained. "You're not making any sense." "Please, God, don't make me go back," Dean whimpered. Aram shook his head in unbelief. "You need to rest, all right? I'll review your video recordings and send them to mission control. But right now, I need you to relax. You can do that for me." Dean nodded weakly. "Good. Go get yourself cleaned up." Dean moved over to the living quarters. Pausing at the mirror, he looked at his reflection. His face was pale. A bead of sweat lined his forehead, and his stomach felt uneasy. Aram's right. I just need to rest. Retiring to his bunk, Dean resigned himself to sleep. "We're going home." Dean smiled and thought little of the itch in his thumb.